Okay. Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode here with the Confience webcast. Today's episode, Compliance Made Simple, Harnessing the Full Potential of LIMS Automation in Your Laboratory. I am Rick Danielson, CEO of Danielson Applied Consulting, LLC, who is dedicated to providing laboratory clients with quality information and service. Joining me today is Dave Sloan. Dave is a senior LIMS implementation engineer with Confience. Introduce yourself, Dave.
Hi, I'm Dave. I got a background in quite a few different laboratories. I start off in food science, and that's what my degree is in, is food science, concentration in chemistry. I then worked in automotive alley doing R&D for glue and adhesives. And then I worked in an environmental lab for a little bit as a wet chemist, and then moved on to implementation. I've implemented over 150 labs at this point.
Well, good. I'm glad we have an expert. We like to have experts on board here. Today, like I said before, our focus is going to be meeting compliance requirements. And we all know that with all the additional certifications and regulations that are out there, laboratory managers and staff are being asked to do a lot more, sometimes with not a whole lot more resources to back them up. And so if you have a LIMS, it's really important to know what are the key features you can use to kind of help, move this along. And this applies to any industry, whether you're in food and beverage, water, wastewater, manufacturing, agricultural, materials testing. I mean, everybody has to meet some level of certification or be accredited within a regulatory structure. So how can we, help move that along a little bit? Typically when we talk about these things, Dave, we're focused so much on, where's the sample and tracing all the components and everything around that. But I think today we're going to focus more on lab management and a lot of that stuff in the background that if you're a lab manager or supervisor, keeping track of everything you need to keep track of, is always a real challenge. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of defining your needs, and then get right into looking at lab operations and just kind of like how we track and deal with our documentation throughout the lab. So just to kind of get things started out, Dave, you are doing all these implementations. Are you seeing an increase in labs that are having to adhere more toward a regulatory or certified structure?
Yes, I definitely am. And those labs that are regulated, the amount of detail that they're starting to have to track is almost mind-boggling.
Yeah, that's right. So you figure you got TNI, ISO. I know that FDA is, their Food Safety Modernization Act is requiring a lot more of the laboratories. And of course, EPA has come out now and updated in January of this year. They've updated a lot of their total coliform rule, disinfection byproduct rule, groundwater rule. All these rules all have methods associated with them, and there's been a big effort on EPA to get those all updated and get them out there. So, you're going to have to be able to track all the things that are associated with that. That plus the fact that organizations like the Consumer Product Safety Commission, they're trying to put more pressure on manufacturers to, reduce risk in production, especially in foods. So, the more information you have, the better. This especially, I know in my lab, I always used to tell my people, whatever you're putting down, just remember you may be sitting in a witness stand someday and have to, talk about what you did. And there's no way you're going to remember. So the best thing to do is to document everything, document everything. So in supporting your general lab organization, as we know, there's just talking about staff to start with and permissions. Give us some idea of what it's like when you go into a lab. What is it you expect from the lab when you're setting up these different permissions for the staff and how you go about doing that?
As far as what I expect for them to give me to help me do my job,
Yes.
Usually, the what I always start with is asking for a bench sheet because they're usually already doing some sort of compliance and with this information already. So I usually ask me, give me your paper system. That'll help me learn the best way to transform that information digitally. So that's usually where I start with. I always like to say if you record it, you can report it. So I always want to get that information from their current paper system into the LIMS. So that's usually where I start with.
Okay. And then as far as assigning permissions and such to staff, what's the structure usually when you go into a lab and you sit down with people?
Well, I usually start with the LIMS admin or the high level people. They're going to have the most permission. We kind of get the system configured, go from there, and then we kind of work our way down to the actual lab staff. And usually that kind of works its way out so we know what permission they need. So we can have just general user permission, just for their area. Usually it's configured by their department or what areas they need to get into. We'll remove the LIMS admin features, stuff like that for the end users.
Okay. And speaking of the manager themselves, is there like a certain, I mean, they're going to have obviously access to like everything, right? But they can't always have all access to everything all the time. What's the best way for them to kind of organize that information for them to keep a pulse on the what's going on in the lab?
The best way to organize it really is, we already have simple permissions baked into Sample Master, so it's just kind of giving them their roles or what they really need access to.
Okay.
We kind of start with giving them the LIMS admin roles, and we'll take away features they might not need, things like that.
And can they set up notifications?
Yes, they
To,
absolutely
to
can.
yeah, and how does that usually present itself?
So it depends. Usually people say they want notifications for everything, but in real life practice, they don't want to get a notification for everything because it gets
Right.
overwhelming. So we usually will have like notifications for key results, results above or below a certain thing, or a presence for a bacteriological sample that'll hit them with an alert. And then we'll usually typically do like report summaries for everything else so that they're not bogged down with everything. Maybe a daily summary of everything or a weekly summary.
So, and as far as like daily goes, do you find yourself helping people like put together things like dashboards that compile information for them on a like a scheduled basis?
The dashboards more when you log in are more just in your face information. So one of the most popular dashboards that I help build are like turnaround times, overdue. If you're a lab that focuses on priority sampling, kind of like a list of everything that's not the normal, so that's right in your face. Orders
Mhm.
to report, things that need to be approved, that kind of information. So when you log in, it's kind of right in your face of I need to see this information.
Yeah, I think that's, because again, there's so much coming at you as a manager just from people walking up and, it goes in one ear out the other as soon as something new, comes in. And this kind of switching up a little bit. So another area I know that, and I have to admit, I'll come clean that I always had issues in tracking was my kappas. Okay. Now, we know that there has to be a documented process that, that records, that we've received complaints, we evaluate it, we have to make decisions on them, and we have to do something about it. So as far as setting up corrective actions, what's been your experience in setting that up for people?
Usually, we break it down into different categories of what you want. We can set up different categories of where the corrective actions are going to fall into line. I'm usually more focused on the lab personnel corrections, maybe a QC batch failure, something along those lines, but it can really, encompass anything. So really getting the categories down right when we configure it is key. What they want to keep track of, and then like the level of seriousness, assigning ownership to that so someone you can see it from start to completion.
Right, right, right. And I think what's really important is, having the due dates. Now, I
Yes.
mean, I'm like the last guy who wants to be nagged, but if I'm not, it's not probably going to happen. So, you need to have that nudge that says, hey, you got to get on this, right? And it's not just, okay, you've recorded your nonconformity. Someone has to, within a certain period of time, do the evaluation for the root cause, right? Right. and then you have to come up with an action plan and a resolution, and that also leads to preventative actions. And I think Confiance software deals with that, right?
Yep.
Being able to record all these things. And the best part about this is even when I was doing it all on paper, just trying to find it all, scampering around and especially if, prior to an assessment, and trying to pull these files out of a file cabinet and put it all together. It's just so much easier to be able to pull it up and describe in your software experience, how does that present itself when somebody wants to sit down and look at this list of corrective actions?
Well, that's where really databases and LIMS thrive, right? Is you have the information recorded, and it's the database's job to get that information out quickly. So, about, I would say 75% of the time, you can just go in the user interface and just click and get the information if you want. And then
Hmm.
you always have the option of building a custom report, which is going to take the information from every which part of the limbs and push it together into one concise thing that has all there. And that's always an
Right.
option as well.
Okay. Okay. And then I know another area that sometimes is difficult to keep track of unless it is automated, I think, is tracking what goes on with your employee and their training records. And especially if you have a lab of significant size, right? Then, you have to, not only do you have like proficiency testing, but you have to keep track of demonstration capabilities, all their certifications. So how do you associate those things with a staff member in the software?
And I just want to say too that always gave me anxiety when I had to do my training. My manager would always last minute, Dave, you got to do it this week, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my god, I got so much to do. Hopefully, I can pass, kind of thing. So you kind of get a list of your employees. You get a list of what you're going to keep track of. So you have your IDOCs, maybe yearly proficiency testing. You can come up with those things. You then associate that with a test. So it'd be, Dave certified to run pH or alkalinity. You have a date, a start and end date of it. So you'll get a notification that yes, it's coming up. So you won't
Right.
give me anxiety to do it at the end of the week. And then you can always attach the record too, which is really nice. Proof that I passed. You can be attaching that to that final record.
Right. And then if you have, let's say someone goes out and does a training, they come back and they got their neat little certificate of training, that can also be stored and associated with that person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. You can do individual records of it, which is ideal because then you can call it up. You can have a yearly log of all the ones that they had and they passed on.
Okay. Okay, that's great. That's great. And then the last thing I kind of want to get into is another one of these administrative things that's kind of like I don't want to call it a backwater because again it is important to keep track of inventory control, instrument maintenance, right? I mean these are all things that I used to hire. I mean, this was before LIMS. I'd hire that high school summer student to come in and go through and go through all my inventory and make sure that my Excel file was up to date. Are the make sure that the instruments, we have all the model numbers and everything in there. I think that one of the powers of the LIMS is, as we know, why don't you describe like how standards chemicals, just very briefly, how they're linked to methods? How
Yeah.
do you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there's always two things that people are trying to track with chemical inventory. One is the quantities on hand. How much do I actually have left to reorder? I remember one of the first days when I worked in the environmental lab, as I told somebody that we're getting low on something, and she's like, "What? No one ever tells me we're getting low. They tell me that we're out of it, and then I got to rush order it." So you want to prevent those kind of things from happening, and then you also need to document the lot number that you use. I use this lot number with it. So there's a couple different things going on. You're going to get a track of like your certified vendors or manufacturers, depending on what terminology you want to use. You can call it whatever term. You're going to want to link that to a test. So typically, we'll have a test pH or TSS or whatever. It doesn't really matter what the test is, but you associate what chemicals you want to track with it and the amount typically used per sample. There's actually a couple different categories because some things like gloves or buffer calibration, I'm not going to be deducting per sample. I'm going to be using it once for running that test. So you kind of assign a category to it, but then you list out all those supplies and you assign how it needs to be deducted.
Right, right, right. And so that I think that that's really important that, this notification. So, I mean, talk about like use of a dashboard, right? So if you wanted to have a weekly or biweekly dashboard that would pop up and say, this, here's all your low level things or you have to order, and not necessarily to the manager. I mean, you could send that to an admin whose job it is
Exactly.
purchasing, right?
Exactly. They don't need
Yeah,
to be a LIMS user. You can send those notifications to whomever.
yeah, exactly. And then this also can apply. This type of tracking applies to equipment as well, right?
Yep.
So how do you what do you capture there about instrumentation?
So, I like the term equipment because, when I think of instrument, I think of it as actual, machine that's running it, giving you the result. But in
Okay.
reality, all the equipment you touch needs to be tracked. And I used to laugh because we only had one desiccator and one vacuum pump, and I'm still having to record all that information. So you
Right.
basically have a list of all your equipment, and then you associate it to the test, right? Because there might be three balances in the laboratory. In my case, there was two. There was an analytical balance and like a low level balance, but I'd have to pick which one I used and write down that ID. So you basically get a list of all the possible equipment that could be used for that test, and then it's just simple drop downs for the analyst to say this is the actual equipment I used.
That's right. Okay. And then you can also assign, like what I like is like the calibration dates, and the updates, and then you can put, right, you can put different levels of restrictions based on where you are in the calibration history of the equipment.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And then you can also then so think about what we just said about staff members. So if you have someone whose training is coming up, you can say, hey, you can't use this equipment until all of your paperwork is all up to date. And likewise, oh, you can't use that equipment until you've calibrated the equipment. So this way everything gets covered, and you can, like I said before, you can generate lists. You can bring data out of the database and keep track on these things before they become a problem.
Exactly. You can get a nice summary of everything that needs to get recalibrated or recertified within a month or 2 weeks, so you can stay ahead of the game. Yeah.
Well, we could go on and on, but we're not going to. So I want to thank you, Dave, for joining us today, and I'd like to thank everyone who's tuned in to this webinar from start to finish. Confiance is driven by the mission to provide automated lab management and data that our customers can act on to build trusted products and a thriving planet. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can stay up to date on this and future recordings by following our LinkedIn company page. Drop us a comment, a like, or a share. We'd love to hear from you and answer your questions, so don't hesitate to reach out. And if you want to learn even more about how your lab can streamline operations, improve quality standards, request a demo at www.confiance.io. You might even get Dave and I giving you a demo. I'd like that. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in and have a great day. Thank you
Thanks,
very
Rick.
much.
Bye, everyone.